This is the second of 2 videos on project management. So what is a project? We talked a little bit about this in the first video, and it's good to remind ourselves when we're talking about project management what a project management is. As defined by the Project Management Institute, a project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So let's break that down a little bit. It is temporary. It has a very specific start date and a very specific end date. It does not go on and on. It also produces a unique result. This is not a kind of a result that we're going to get every single time we do something, because we're not doing it every single time. This is once. We are going to get a new building, or we are going to get a new piece of software, or whatever the case may be. And then finally, it brings about change, or not finally, it brings about change to the organization. This unique product, service, or result will be different, not something we're going to see regularly. And it has some unknown elements which add to its risk. And those unknown elements come due to its unique nature. We always have risk in business, right? There's risk in the marketplace, there's risk in rolling out a new product, etc. But in the case of a project, due to its unique result, due to its temporary status, due to the fact that it's going to be bringing about change, these are not things we see in the regular course of business. And so we have heightened risk on top of our standard risk. Projects are different from operations. Operations are the day-to-day things that we do. It's the work done in organizations to sustain the business, pay people, make our product, pay bills, collect on bills, etc. Excuse me. And so operations are ongoing. We do them every day or every week or every month. They're repetitive. It's the same thing over and over and over again. When you make your product, you make it in exactly the same way. When you pay your employees, you do it in exactly the same way with the exact same payroll company, etc., etc. And the results are the same, right? Payroll should be the same pretty much every week, or every 2 weeks or month, or however often you pay people. Your product, you want to be the same every single time. That's what makes a good product, is consistency. And as a result, there's very minimal risk, right? It's not to say something can't go wrong with payroll, but the odds that it does are pretty slim. So what sorts of restrictions do we have in this project work that we're doing? What sorts of constraints do we have? There are basically 3 things which we need to focus on, and we've talked about this in the first video. These are the 3 things that all projects hinge upon. These 3 things need to be negotiated at the beginning of the project, and as project managers, we need to keep an eye on them and perhaps renegotiate them if there is a radical change as the project goes on. Of course, those 3 things that we referenced in the first video are scope. What's the actual work that's going to get done? What is that wish list of things we need to do? Schedule. When does the work need to be done? What is my due date? And then finally, cost. What resources can we use to complete the project, whether those be monetary or human resources? And you notice that creates a nice little triangle. It is often referred to as the 3-legged stool of the project. However, you notice that there's a hole there in the triangle. And that hole represents the 4th hidden factor, that if we don't maintain the balance of schedule, scope, and cost, what's the thing that is going to change, that is going to allow us to balance out? So for example, if the people who asked you to do this project, after you've agreed to the schedule and the cost and the scope, come to you in the middle of the project and say, you know, we really need this other thing that we didn't have in the original scope. Can you do that for us? If you do that extra thing without adjusting the cost or the schedule or both, chances are you're going to have an imbalanced project. And when you have an imbalanced project, the thing that changes, the thing that restores order to the universe, is quality. Your quality will go down because you didn't spend as much money, or because you didn't take the time to add that additional scope. So what skills do you need as a project manager? Well, you need some leadership skills, and we talked a lot about leadership in the previous video, and we'll talk a little bit about it more, but you need to be a leader. You need to be able to take a group of people to that destination, to that goal. You need to be able to communicate. That is an absolute necessity. Most project managers fail in their communication. They don't tell people bad news when there is bad news. They forget to remind people of the good job that they're doing. They are so intent on doing the work that needs to be done that they forget to tell the stakeholders how they're progressing. Communication is critical. You need to be able to motivate. While you may have great employees in your team, they're going to have bad days. And your ability to rouse them and get them back on task and excited about what they're doing is a really important thing to do. I would say, though, that if you're spending all your time motivating people, there's something else going wrong. But on an occasion where you all have worked hard for 6 weeks, and while progress is being made, it feels like it's not being made fast enough right now, that's the time when stepping in and giving some motivation is critical. You need to be organized. There are lots of moving parts, and you will miss things if you are not well organized. You need to be able to prioritize. So many times, because there are so many moving parts and so many things that need to get done to make a project successful, you'll have lots of demands on your time and your attention and demands on your resources, and this is important to get done. It's all important to get done. The question is, what needs to get done now? What needs to get done first? And the ability to understand that flow, that level of being critical to the entire success of the project, and say no to the other things is important. You need to have problem-solving skills. As we said, when you go into a project, there are lots of unknowns. What are you going to do when your drywaller catches COVID-19 and suddenly can't work on the day that you have them scheduled? What are you going to do when the funds that you had budgeted for this project are no longer enough because there's a tariff on the goods coming in from China, and suddenly those costs that you had budgeted for a year ago are now twice as much? That problem-solving skill is critical. You need to be able to adapt. The world changes, things change, plans change. The balance in the budget or the costs may change. The schedule may change. Because there is all of this unknown, because you do have a deadline, you need to be able to make changes. And so being adaptable, being able to deviate from the plan when necessary is critical to success of a project manager. You have to be able to manage meetings. Once you are in the professional world, you will find there is very little more frustrating than the only result of a meeting is another meeting. The ability to stick to your hour-long time frame, if that's how long you've budgeted for the meeting, and still get stuff done and still allow people to be heard, is a skill that needs to be practiced and refined. Your employees, especially if they're competent and good at what they do, will want to have their voices heard. And yet, you don't want to rehash the same issue over and over and over again. So how do you gracefully cut off that conversation to move on to other things without sounding like you're not listening to them? How do you make sure you end the meeting on time? How to make sure that you actually accomplish something in the meeting, and there are actions people can take other than preparing for another meeting. You need critical thinking. You need to be able to understand what assumptions that you are making when making a decision, and recognize that those assumptions may be incorrect. You need to be able to break down a problem into logical components. You need to be able to get to the root source of a problem. Critical thinking is a skill that we are sorely lacking in general, and as a result, Sometimes our project managers don't necessarily have great critical thinking skills. But the ability to break down a problem, to ignore assumptions, or at least recognize that you're making assumptions and that those assumptions may be incorrect, is a key component to being a good project manager. And it's really important to have a sense of humor. Things are going to go wrong. And the ability to laugh at yourself, laugh at the absurdity of certain things sometimes, and hopefully get other people to laugh with you is really important. Sense of humor is a very subjective thing. I tend to have a very dark sense of humor, and so things that I think are funny, sometimes other people don't. And there are other people's senses of humor that I don't get. They will be laughing about something that I think is cruel or just silly to the point of it's not funny. And I like to be silly. I think there's funny in silly. So having a sense of humor and knowing where to use it, but most importantly when talking about a sense of humor, the ability to laugh at yourself, the ability to laugh at absurd things that you have no control over and shake them off as a way of resilience is really critical to being a good project manager. The last thing I want to talk about in this video, and frankly the focus of the video, are sources of power. As a project manager, we talked about leadership and that you need to be able to lead people to the goal. Sometimes in leadership, you're going to have people do something that they don't want to do and get them to do that. And the ability to get people to do something that they don't want to do is what we call power. And you have lots of sources of power as a project manager. The most obvious one, and the one people tend to overly rely on, is positional power, right? I'm the project manager, I'm in charge, thus do this because I said so. The problem with only relying on that particular source of power is you may need things from people who don't care that you're the project manager. For example, having spent my career in IT, one of the things that we often do is install new software systems, and those software systems may affect multiple people in the organization and multiple departments in the organization. So while we may be installing a software system that is going to primarily affect the accounting department, it may also have some effects on people in human resources or on people in sales, etc. And we may need those people in those departments to do some testing for us or give us some feedback. And it is not uncommon in organizations for either the people in those departments or the heads of those departments to go, I don't have time for that. I got my own job to do. I don't have time to give you to do that testing when you need that testing done or when you want that testing done. And so I can't say, well, I'm the project manager, you need to do this, because they're not part of my project. I'm not their boss. So only relying on positional power, only relying on that title to get something done is not always going to be successful. Within the scope of your project and with your team, perhaps it will be successful more often than not. But once you have to reach outside that team, they may not care that you're the project manager. So now you got to figure out a different way to get them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do on their own. So let's take a look at some other sources of power. There's informational power. Sometimes as the project manager, because it's your job to collect information about what's being done, what the goals of the project are, etc., you will know things that other people don't know. And so your ability to withhold that information or hand that information out can be a source of power. If you need a worker to do something, you might share with them, look, the reason we're asking you to do this particular thing is because it's a key to some testing that we need to do 3 days from now. And if you don't get your piece done, we're not going to be able to do that testing, right? That's some information that you have about the process that other people don't have. Or maybe you can say, look, I know we're not supposed to tell people this, but if we meet this particular deadline, we'll get a bonus. By sharing that information, you may have encouraged them to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. And so you can share information with people to change that dynamic. There's referent power. Sometimes you might be respected because of previous experiences that they've had with you. Sometimes we call this benefit of the doubt, right? Hey, I've worked with Jane for a long time, and while I'm not understanding why she's asking me to do this now, she's always seemed to know what she's had going on, and so I'm going to give her the benefit of the doubt this time. Another aspect of referent power is, especially in a new team, they may not know anything about you as a project manager or your skills or your leadership or whatever, but they may know someone who knows you. And so, because I trust Al, and Al says, you're going to like Jane, she's really good at what she does, I confer some of the respect and trust I have in Al onto Jane. That is a reference that Jane has. And so she has some power, not because I know Jane, but because I know Al, and Al trusts Jane. That's referent power. There's always personal and charismatic power. There's some people you just like. There's some people you just want to do things for. If you're unfamiliar, there is a book out there called Strengths Finder, where they have a theory of leadership that we all have certain strengths, and I think they list 23 or so strengths. And so you take a quiz, and it tells you what your top 5 strengths, it actually tells you all your strengths, but it really highlights your top 5. And their theory is, why focus on the other 18 or so strengths that you're not good at, and instead really amplify the 5 that you are, right? Become that expert, become that really do the things that you do well, and stop trying to fix the things you don't do well. And one of the reason I bring this up is one of the strengths, one of the personality characteristics that they talk about in there is something called woo, W-O-O. And this is like, wooing a spouse, right? That's an old-fashioned term for the courtship process. And the concept of woo within strengths is that you have this personal or charismatic power. That is not one of my strengths, but I've seen it in the list, and one of the characteristics of woo, one of the pieces of evidence that you have woo, is it says people will give you things for no reason. And I always thought that was really weird, and probably because I don't have woo. And yet, my son, people will give him things for no reason. And when he took the StrengthsFinder test, sure enough, woo was one of his strengths. And so it's that charisma, it is that magnetism, it is that, sometimes we call it natural leadership, although I would argue just because people like you doesn't mean they want to follow you. But it's that warm personality, it's that feeling of, I want to be on the same team as this person. That can definitely allow you to get people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, because they want to be around you and be with you. This source of power, avoiding power, is one that the little description down here I don't think gives justice to, because it implies, in my mind, the little description implies negligence, right? I'm going to refuse to act, get involved, or make decisions. It's like, yeah, there's something going wrong over there, but I'm just going to ignore it. It is not ignoring. Avoiding power is not ignoring. It is not avoiding in the sense of running away from. Let me tell you a story that I think really highlights avoiding power. The Chicago Bulls of the 1990s were the best basketball team in the world. And they had a star player who I'm sure you've heard of, Michael Jordan. And in the middle of Michael Jordan's career, in the height of his success, he retired. The Bulls had just won 3 straight NBA championships. They were obviously the best team in the world. and Michael Jordan quit and retired and was out of basketball for over a year. And so, in his absence, it was just one player, right? We shouldn't fall off that much. And they had another really good player, considered one of the 50 best players of all time, in the Hall of Fame, Scottie Pippen. And so with Michael Jordan's retirement, Scottie Pippen was the man. He was the leader. He was the best player. And so people looked to him. So once again, the Bulls made the playoffs, and they were in a critical playoff game where not only were they behind in the game, but they were behind in the series. And so if the Bulls lost to this game, they were done for the year. So the Bulls also had one of the greatest basketball coaches of all time, Phil Jackson. And the game is down to what is going to be the last possession. Either the Bulls are going to make the shot and win the game, or they're going to miss the shot and lose the game. So the Bulls call timeout, team comes over to the bench, and Phil Jackson draws up a play to win the game. Scottie Pippen, thinking he's the man, he's going to get the ball, he's going to take the shot, he's going to win the game, he's going to be the hero because he's the leader of the team. Phil Jackson doesn't draw up the play for Scottie Pippen. He draws up the play for a newcomer, Tony Kukoc, who came over from playing basketball in Europe, was the best European basketball player at the time, had joined the Bulls, really good player, probably not as good a player as Scottie Pippen. And so the fact that he wasn't going to get to be the hero, he wasn't going to get to take the last shot, angered Scottie Pippen, and Scottie Pippen refused to go into the game. So Phil Jackson sends in another player, they run the play, Tony Kukoc takes the shot, wins the game. Now, some leaders, some coaches would go into the locker room and tear Pippen a new one. And tell him how he let the team down, how he was being selfish, how they needed him, how this was just one play and he would have another opportunity to be a hero, etc. Phil Jackson did not do that. And Phil Jackson was not afraid to tear into people. But Phil Jackson recognized that he was not the person to be giving that message at that time. Scottie was already ticked off at him. Scottie was already angry at him. For Phil to then add to that negative feeling by telling him he wasn't doing what he needed to do, etc., was not going to be constructive. It was not going to allow the team, it was not going to allow them to get that project of winning the NBA championship moving forward. And Phil Jackson also knew that there were teammates of Scottie Pippen's who were just as upset with Scottie as Phil was. Teammates that Scottie respected, teammates that Scottie would listen to. So Phil Jackson just stayed out of the locker room. And instead, he let Bill Cartwright, a guy who'd been in the NBA for decades, not a particularly stellar player, he was good enough to start in the NBA, but definitely wasn't a great scorer, wasn't a great rebounder, but was a great person and a great leader who had worked long and hard to get to the point where he was on a team that was a winning team and had a winning attitude. And he was just as mad at Scottie as Phil Jackson was. And he went into the locker room and told Scottie all the things that he needed to hear. That he let the team down, that he was being selfish, that it was just one play and he was going to get to be the hero later, and that everyone knew he was the man, and no one needed a special play run for him to show that. And perhaps he was more valuable as a decoy because the other team knew he was the man. And Scottie cried when he heard that because he knew that Bill Cartwright was right. That wouldn't have been the case had Phil Jackson told him. Phil Jackson accurately, successfully used avoiding power, knowing that his presence was not going to help the situation, that there were other ways of resolving the situation naturally without his intervention at all. That is a true example of how avoiding power can be used successfully. The next power is expert power. The more you know about something, the more people will probably recognize that you know what you're talking about, and thus should subsume what they think, because they know they don't know as much about this as you, and listen to you. This is frankly the kind of power you assume that I have when I talk about things in these videos, that I have experience, that I know what I'm talking about, that I have skills that you should listen to. And so that's why you bother to listen to these videos, is because you think that I know what I'm talking about. You can use reward power, right? Do this and I'll give you a treat. You can also use punitive power, do this or else. This can be used for the whole team. These can be used individually. Tried and true skills. They have their limitations, though. If you're constantly punishing people, or you're constantly giving them treats, they're going to start expecting it, and it's no longer a reward, it's an expectation. And if you're constantly punishing them, you're going to diminish morale to the point where they're just like, I don't care anymore. Do what you want to with me. I'm sick of this. You can use ingratiating power, which is basically, and once again, I'm not a big fan of the words in the sub-bullet point where it talks about flattery. Yes, you are going to say nice things about and to people, but flattery implies insincerity. And the thing about ingratiating power is this: you have to mean it. People will be able to tell pretty quickly when you're blowing sunshine at them and not meaning it. When I tell you how much I enjoy spending time with you, when I tell you how smart I think you are and how good your discussions are, it's because I mean it. Now, am I aware that by telling you those things, you may be more likely to get your homework in on time, or in my case, participate in discussions a little more? Of course I am. That doesn't mean I don't mean it. Because if you use pure flattery, if you just tell people that they're great and they're not, and not only do they know they're not, they know you know they're not, well, they're not going to believe you. And trust is really important in leadership. Kind of the flip side of ingratiating power is guilt-based power. And I'm sure you all have experienced this at some point, because this tends to be the go-to power of the parent. This is that, no, that's fine. You go out and do that stupid thing, and I'll be happy to come visit you in the hospital, or I'll come sit in jail with you if you get arrested. That's one of the things that my dad said to me when I was a kid. He's like, if you ever get arrested in jail and get put in jail, I'm not going to come bail you out. I'm going to come sit there with you, because I will have failed as a father to the point where you've made decisions to put yourself in jail. Right? That's guilt-based power. That's, wow, God, I don't want to have my dad sit in jail. And failure as a father. He's not a failure as a father, right? That's what guilt-based power is doing. And in work, you can use guilt-based power, right? You can say, look, it's my kid's birthday this weekend, and if we don't get this done in time, I'm going to have to miss her birthday party. And she doesn't turn 3 every day. And, by simply telling that story, you're laying guilt on your teammates to say, if you don't get this done, you're going to affect me negatively. Once again, guilt-based power and ingratiating power, and any of these powers, frankly, should be situational. You shouldn't rely on one of them all the time. You shouldn't overuse any of them. And fundamentally, you only need to use them when the team is not moving in the direction that they need to move. Power is about getting people to do things that they don't otherwise want to do. No sense in handing out a reward for something they already want to do. Or no sense in trying to punish them for something they don't want to do in the first place. Don't threaten someone with something that they're not going to do anyway. These sources of power are about, in situations, getting people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't want to do for the greater good. So that's our discussion of project management. Our last video is going to be about ethics. I will try and keep it short. Ethics is one of those things that I could talk about forever. But I hope you're thinking a little bit more about what it takes to be a leader, how you have power, and how you can use those in the greater good of managing a project. So look forward to seeing you in the last video.